And if we look at not a real person, but a drawing including more things here, you can see that there's no diaphragm or anything separating abdomen from pelvis. Along our posterior wall, we do have the diaphragm contributing. So the diaphragm stretches pretty far down the posterior wall and will form the superior part of the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. And in the midline, we'll have the vertebral column. And then we have a series of new muscles that I'll introduce today, but you won't see in dissection until next Wednesday, I think. So sort of medially, we have psoas major and psoas minor. Lateral to that is quadratus lumborum. And then the transversus abdominis extends all the way to the posterior and will contribute to the posterior wall as well. Our lateral wall will be some mostly familiar muscles. So our external abdominal and internal abdominal obliques and transversus abdominis, as well as another muscle that we'll see next week as well called iliacus that will sit along this medial sort of bowl within the ilium. And then our anterior wall is again going to be a bunch of familiar structures. So our three abdominal muscles already mentioned, as well as rectus abdominis. There are a few other structures on the anterior abdominal wall that you should take note of while you're dissecting. So once you open up the abdominal cavity, don't just flop everything open and forget about the fact that there was an abdominal wall there. There's structures on the anterior abdominal wall that you'll need to know. In particular, there are a series of folds on the anterior abdominal wall that are going to contain different structures. So right in the midline, we have the median umbilical fold. And this is going to contain a remnant of fetal development. So the obliterated allantoic duct or urachus. So this is median, it's right in the middle, so there's only one median umbilical fold. A little bit lateral to that, we have the medial umbilical fold. And this is going to contain the remnants of the umbilical arteries. And then further laterally, we have the lateral umbilical fold. And this is going to contain the inferior epigastric vessels that we saw externally during our dissection on Wednesday. So there'll be one median umbilical fold, two medials, and two laterals. If we look at this in cross-section, so here we have our median right in the midline, medials on either side, and then our laterals are out over top of the inferior epigastrics. And at the bottom here, I've labeled that this is a cross-section below the arcuate line. So how can you guys tell definitively that this is a cross-section below the arcuate line, other than that I just showed you where the cross-section was taken?
All the muscles are above the rectus abdominis.
Yeah, so if you look at our rectus sheath, our three abdominal muscles, their aponeurotic parts, are all going anterior. They're all forming the anterior border. If we were above the arcuate line, what would we find going posterior? Transversus abdominis and part of internal, right. All right, so the first thing we're going to do when we get into class today is open up the abdomen. And you should see something like this. I hate to break it to you, it's probably not going to look quite this nice. But we'll see something to this effect here. You'll notice that we can see a few organs right away. And then there's this big sheet of tissue in the front that's covering up a lot of the other organs that we'll talk about in a minute. All right, some of our most obvious features here. The liver is our largest structure in the abdomen. We can also see the esophagus tucking into the abdomen here. And that's going to connect with the stomach. And the stomach will connect distally with the duodenum. That big sheet of mesentery hanging off of this part of the stomach is referred to as the greater omentum. So omentum means apron, and we have this big apron-like sheet of tissue that hangs down over the lower abdominal viscera. Okay.
So the greater omentum wasn't that big one that you showed?
It's the same thing.
Oh, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Right, so it hangs down. So this is the stomach. It hangs down off of that inferior margin of the stomach.
Eric,
Yes?
so the greater omentum is part of the parietal?
No. You mean in terms of
Of
peritoneum?
Yeah,
No, I don't think that counts as.
so it's just
right.
separate.
Yeah, so these sheets of tissue, it's hanging off of a visceral structure, so it's still. So as Dr. Flegel demonstrated on Wednesday, we have these sheets of double layers of peritoneum that are going to suspend organs from either one another or from different parts of the abdominal cavity. And so here we have a double sheet of peritoneum that's connecting the stomach with the liver. So a lot of these connections are referred to as ligaments, and usually the name of the ligament tells you the two structures that are connected. So hepatogastric is a connection between the liver, so anytime you're hepatic or hepato, you're referring to the liver, and the stomach. Gastric refers to stomach. So hepatogastric ligament connects the liver to the stomach. We also have a connection between the liver and the duodenum, and this is called the hepatoduodenal ligament. And these two structures together form the lesser omentum. So we have the greater omentum hanging off this part of the stomach that we call the greater curvature, and we have the lesser omentum connecting the liver with the lesser curvature of the stomach and the duodenum. Right, the stomach has a number of named parts of its own. So the part where the esophagus attaches to it is called the cardia. And then we have this big sort of balloon-shaped portion superiorly called the fundus. And there'll be a little notch in between those two called the cardial notch. The main part of the stomach is called the body of the stomach. I mentioned earlier this sort of left and inferior margin of the stomach is called the greater curvature. And on the right side, we have the lesser curvature. As it approaches the duodenum, it starts to narrow, and we call this the pylorus, or the pyloric part of the stomach. So here's all those same names, just on a more colorful diagram. And the pylorus can be divided into a few different regions. So we have the pyloric antrum right at the base. As it narrows towards the duodenum, that's the pyloric canal. And then the actual boundary between the pylorus and the duodenum is the pyloric orifice. If we open up the stomach and take a closer look at that pyloric orifice, we can see that there's actually a muscular sphincter in here called the pyloric sphincter. And this is going to act to control movement of materials from the stomach into the lower parts of the digestive tract, and more importantly, project backflow of things from the lower part of the digestive tract up into the stomach. Question?
In the dissector, it called that, like, pyloric sphincter thing, it calls it pylorus, but should we call it pylorus or pyloric orifice?
So the pylorus is this whole region.
Okay, because it calls it pyloric part, but then it calls
That's the same thing. Pylorus and pyloric part are synonyms. But the pyloric sphincter and the pyloric orifice would be pretty much the same thing. The sphincter is actually the muscle that opens and closes that orifice. Right, and then since we can see inside the stomach, we can see another feature here, these big ridges that are called gastric folds or rugae. And these are going to allow the stomach to expand and contract based on how much food or whatever is in there. So if you have a really full stomach, it will be expanded, and these folds will be difficult to see. Right, the stomach is continuous with our lower parts of the digestive tract, so it will connect with the small intestine through this C-shaped structure called the duodenum. And then our small intestine is divided into two different parts called the jejunum proximally and the ileum distally. And we'll go over each of these different sections in detail here. All right, so when you open this up and pull the liver out of the way so that you can see something other than liver in the abdomen, we can see part of the duodenum, but really all we can see is this part that's attached right to the stomach. And I said it was a C-shaped structure, and the rest of the C-shape is missing here. And that's because it's going to be diving deep to all of these structures. So down here, it's covered up by the transverse colon and the greater omentum. So if we virtually dissect away a bunch of those things, we can see a little bit more of it. So the duodenum is broken down into 4 different parts. The first part is called the superior part, and this portion is mesenteric. meaning that it's suspended by a mesentery. And in particular, the mesentery that suspends it is that hepatoduodenal ligament that we talked about a few minutes ago. The second part, or the descending part, and the third part, or the horizontal part, are both retroperitoneal. And Dr. Flegel talked about the difference between mesenteric and retroperitoneal, and primarily and secondarily retroperitoneal on Wednesday, and we'll go over it a little bit more on Monday as well to make sure that you guys have it. But the reason we can't see these externally is because they're back up against the back wall of the abdomen. Yeah?
Is the hepatoduodenal ligament, is that the same thing as the mesentery proper?
No. No, the mesentery proper is going to be attaching the small intestine to the back of the abdominal wall. So it's not attaching to the duodenum. All right, and then our fourth part is the ascending part, and this one is partially retroperitoneal, and the very last part, where it's attaching to the small intestine, will be mesenteric. So more diagrammatically, each of these four parts of the duodenum will fall at a different vertebral level, and luckily they fall sort of nicely in order, in that the first part, or the superior part, is typically at first lumbar vertebral level. The descending part, or the second part, is at L2. And this is an important portion of it in that this is where the bile ducts and pancreatic ducts are going to drain into the gut tract. We'll talk more about exactly where those go next Monday when we talk about the pancreas, but just keep that in mind. Our third part, or our horizontal part, is approximately at L3. And then L4 our fourth part kind of screws things up by not going to L4, because this is our ascending part. It's going to go from L3 back up to L2. So the first, second, and third parts follow with the appropriately named lumbar vertebrae. The fourth goes back up. Right, I mentioned a few slides ago that the small intestine is divided up into two parts, the jejunum and the ileum. And when you first open up the abdomen and lift up the transverse colon, you'd see something like this. And so you're not really going to be able to tell one from the other just by looking at them. So if we color them different colors, we can tell them apart in a diagram. We know that our jejunum is the proximal portion, so if you can tell that it's attached to the duodenum up here, you can say that's probably the jejunum. If you can see where it's attached to the colon down in the lower right quadrant, you could probably say that's the ileum. But this isn't something you can just take a look at a big wad of small intestine and say for sure which part is which. But there are specific characteristics for ileum and jejunum that will allow you to differentiate the two. All right, so for the jejunum, particularly what we want to look at in the cadavers has to do with the vascularity to these structures. So the jejunum is going to have long vasa recta. So vasa recta just means straight vessel. So here we're talking about arteries. So we have these long, straight arteries that are reaching out to the intestine itself. And it'll have relatively few of these looping connections between adjacent arteries called arcades. So jejunum has long vasa recta and very few of these lateral connections between the two. The jejunum is more highly vascularized than the ileum, and this gives it more of a deeper red color. The color differences between the two are usually lost in the cadavers. It's hard to look at them and tell them apart. But keep in mind that it's the vascularity that should give them these different colors. We also have a thicker wall in the jejunum. And another structure you won't be able to see, but keep in mind we get relatively few lymphoid nodules in the jejunum. And finally, if we open up the small intestine, you can see that they look quite different internally. So on the inside of the jejunum, we have a lot of large, tightly packed circular folds, or since I know you guys love Latin so much, plicae circularis. So either one. Jejunum will be covered with these circular ridges on the inside. Now for the ileum, as you might guess, is going to have exactly the opposite of everything I just said for the jejunum. So it does have vasa recta, but they're considerably shorter. It has a large number of these looping arcades connecting adjacent arteries. It's less vascularized, so it's more of a pale pink color. It has a thinner wall, more lymphoid tissues. And if you look at the inside, our circular folds are largely absent. There will only be a few, and they'll be relatively low. All right, moving right along, now we get into the large intestine. So we can't see all of the parts of the large intestine in here, but some of the more obvious parts are visible. So running up along the right side of the abdominal cavity, we have the ascending colon. Moving transversely across towards the left is the transverse colon. And then running down the left side, we have the descending colon, which will end in a part called the sigmoid colon. If we kind of pluck out the large intestine so we can see the parts that were hidden in the corners of the abdominal cavity, we can see a few more structures. So the beginning of the large intestine is sort of this blind pouch here called the cecum. And this is the area that's going to be attached to the small intestine. And this is called the ileocecal junction, where the ileum attaches with the cecum. Hanging off of the cecum, we have the appendix, or the vermiform appendix, which you may or may not see in lab today. So obviously a lot of people get their appendices removed, but probably quite a few of the cadavers will still have one. They're not that great of a thing to see, but you should look around and see one because they do have their own mesentery and their own artery. Up from the cecum, we have that ascending colon, and then where the colon bends to move transversely, we have what's called a colic flexure. So we're on the right side here, so this is the right colic flexure. This flexure happens to sit right underneath the liver, so this is also referred to as the hepatic flexure. Then we have our transverse colon, and we need to change directions again. So we're on the left side, so this will be our left colic flexure. And this flexure is right up against the spleen, so this is also called the splenic flexure. You'll notice that the right colic flexure is more inferior than the left, and this has to do with the great differential in size between the spleen and the liver. So the spleen is gigantic, and it kind of crowds everything out of the right upper quadrant of the abdomen, whereas the spleen is relatively small, so the left colic flexure can be higher.